January 17, 1940. Detroit, Michigan. The assembly floor of the Continental Motors Corporation trembled beneath the thunder of machinery. Oil hung in the air, thick, metallic, industrial. In the pale winter light filtering through factory windows, engineers in starched white shirts and oil-stained sleeves gathered around a hulking mass of cast iron and steel. The Continental R-975 radial aircraft engine. It sat there like a displaced god, 9 cylinders arranged in a perfect star, gleaming with fresh machining marks. Originally designed to lift bombers into European skies, it had been deemed obsolete for aviation by military planners who craved more power, more altitude, more speed. The engine had failed its audition for the clouds, but in that moment, as steam rose from cooling vats and the distant hum of war echoed across the Atlantic, no one in that room could have imagined that this rejected piece of machinery would become the mechanical heart of the most mass-produced tank in American history, the M4 Sherman, and that its steady, relentless rhythm would drive steel treads across the bocage of Normandy, the hills of Italy, the forests of the Ardennes, and ultimately into the belly of the Third Reich itself. The engine sat silent, waiting, rejected by the sky, but not yet finished with history. By the winter of 1940, the world was already burning. Poland had been crushed beneath the synchronized treads of German Panzers and the boots of the Wehrmacht. France, the undefeated titan of World War I, would fall within months. The Blitzkrieg, lightning war, had introduced a new and terrifying doctrine: speed, mechanization, coordination. The Panzer divisions, spearheaded by machines like the Panzer III and the Panzer IV, tore through defensive lines with a ferocity that made the trench warfare of the previous generation seem almost quaint. The tank was no longer an experimental curiosity. It was the future, and Germany had mastered it first. America watched from across the ocean with a mixture of horror and unease. The United States Army, still reeling from budget cuts and isolationist sentiment, possessed fewer than 400 tanks in 1940, many of them outdated relics from World War I or flimsy interwar experiments. The M2 medium tank, the Army's most modern design, was already obsolete before it left the factory floor. Under-armored, undergunned, a relic of a bygone tactical philosophy. American military planners knew the truth even if the public did not. If the United States entered this war, it would be facing the most mechanized, most lethal ground force ever assembled. And it would be doing so with a tank corps that barely existed. What America did possess, however, was something the Axis powers could never replicate: industrial might on a scale unimaginable to the rest of the world. The factories of Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland, the same foundries that churned out automobiles, tractors, and refrigerators, could be retooled, repurposed, and unleashed. America did not need to invent the perfect tank. It needed to build thousands of good enough tanks and build them faster than the enemy could destroy them. That philosophy, born of pragmatism and industrial confidence, would define the Sherman, and it would all begin with a rejected airplane engine no one wanted. The Continental R-975 had been born in the 1930s, an era when radial engines dominated aviation. Its 9 cylinders, arranged in a radial star pattern, produced roughly 400 horsepower, respectable, reliable, but ultimately insufficient as aircraft grew heavier and faster. By 1940, it had been phased out of frontline aviation roles. Warehouses were filled with surplus R-975 engines, gathering dust, their aluminum housings slowly oxidizing in the humid American air. To the Army Air Corps, they were obsolete. To the Ordnance Department, desperately searching for a solution to America's tank crisis, they were a godsend. The challenge was not just finding an engine. It was finding an engine that could be produced in massive quantities without disrupting war production, that could fit into a medium tank chassis, that could be maintained by crews with minimal training, and, most importantly, that already existed. The R-975 checked every box. It was not the most powerful engine. It was not the most modern, but there were thousands of them sitting in storage, and Continental could produce thousands more using existing tooling and expertise. In the cold calculus of wartime logistics, the R-975 was perfect precisely because it was available. In the spring of 1941, as German Panzers rolled into Yugoslavia and Greece, the first R-975 engine was fitted into the prototype of what would become the M4 Sherman tank. Engineers had to modify the engine's mounting, redesign the cooling system, and reconfigure the exhaust to account for the fact that this engine would now sit inside an armored box instead of an open airframe. But it worked. The engine fired. The tank moved. And with that first stuttering roar of cylinders igniting, the Sherman was born. The German Panzer crews who first encountered the Sherman in North Africa in late 1942 did not yet understand what they were facing. To them, the early Shermans seemed almost laughable. Tall, boxy, under-armored compared to the low-slung, brutally efficient Panzer IVs and the newly introduced Tiger-wide German tankers, hardened by years of conquest across Europe, expected the Americans to crumble as the French had, as the British had in the desert before Montgomery's arrival. They expected hesitation, confusion, tactical naivety. They expected to dominate. What they did not expect was the sheer number of Shermans. At the Battle of El Alamein in October and November of 1942, British and American forces fielded over 500 tanks, many of them Shermans. Even when German guns found their marks, and they did often, the Shermans kept coming. For every tank destroyed, two more appeared over the dunes. For every crew lost, another crew took its place. The Germans had built superior machines, but the Allies had built a superior system. A system of production, logistics, and relentless mechanical endurance powered by that rejected radial engine. A Panzer commander named Hans von Luck, a highly decorated officer of the 21st Panzer Division, later wrote in his memoirs about the strange cognitive dissonance of fighting the Americans in Tunisia in early 1943. "We could destroy their tanks," he wrote, "but we could not destroy their will to replace them. Every morning, there were more. It was as though we were fighting not an army but a factory. That factory was Detroit, and its heart was the Continental R-975. By 1943, the Sherman had become the backbone of Allied armored operations. Factories across the United States were producing them at a staggering rate, more than 2,000 Shermans per month at the program's peak. The R-975 engine, once deemed too weak for aviation, was now being manufactured in 11 different plants. Workers who had never touched a military vehicle before the war were assembling engines with assembly line precision. Women, many of whom had been excluded from industrial work before Pearl Harbor, operated lathes and welded cylinder heads. The engine was simple enough to build quickly, robust enough to withstand the punishment of combat, and, most crucially, common enough that spare parts were plentiful. The Sherman was never intended to be invincible. It was intended to be everywhere, and the R-975 made that possible. But the human cost of that philosophy became brutally apparent in the hedgerows of Normandy in the summer of 1944. The bocage, dense, centuries-old hedges that crisscrossed the French countryside, turned every field into a death trap. German Panther and Tiger tanks, concealed in the foliage, ambushed advancing Shermans with devastating effectiveness. The Panther's 75mm gun could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor from over a mile away. The Sherman's 75mm gun struggled to penetrate the Panther's frontal armor even at close range. American tank crews began to grimly refer to the Sherman as the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter company whose slogan was "Lights every time." The implication was horrifying. Shermans burned easily, and yet the Shermans kept coming. The R-975 engine, despite its humble origins, proved almost impossible to kill through mechanical failure. Unlike the German tanks, which were marvels of engineering complexity, and therefore prone to breakdowns, difficult to repair, and catastrophically vulnerable to supply line disruptions, the Sherman was mechanically simple. A crew could swap out an R-975 engine in the field in a matter of hours. German tanks required specialized tools, cranes, and trained technicians. The Panther's Maybach engine was a masterpiece. The R-975 was a workhorse. In the grinding arithmetic of attrition warfare, the workhorse won. Lieutenant Belton Cooper, an officer in the 3rd Armored Division, witnessed the horrifying calculus firsthand. His memoirs, Death Traps, recount the carnage of the Normandy campaign with unflinching clarity. "We could lose 3 Shermans for every Panther we destroyed," he wrote, "and we did. But we had 3 Shermans to lose. The Germans did not." Cooper's division alone lost over 600 tanks during the 11-month campaign from Normandy to the Elbe River. Yet the division never ran out of tanks. Replacement Shermans arrived almost as quickly as the originals were destroyed, and every single one of them was powered by that rejected radial engine, chugging away with 9-cylinder persistence. The sound of the R-975 became a symbol in itself, a low, steady, unmistakable growl. Unlike the high-pitched whine of German diesels or the guttural roar of British Meteor engines, the radial Continental produced a rhythmic, almost musical thrum. Tankers described it as the sound of security, of inevitability. To American and Allied soldiers, that sound meant reinforcements were arriving. To German soldiers, it meant the opposite. No matter how many they destroyed, there would always be more. By late 1944, German commanders were reporting to Berlin that American tank production had become a strategic weapon in itself. It was not just that American tanks outnumbered German tanks, it was that the Americans could afford to lose them. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of German forces in the West, reportedly told his staff during the Battle of the Bulge, "We are not fighting the Americans. We are fighting American industry." The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's desperate winter offensive in December 1944, illustrated this truth with brutal clarity. The Germans attacked with their best remaining units, their newest tanks, and the element of surprise. For a brief, terrifying moment, it seemed as though the blitzkrieg had returned. American lines buckled. Entire divisions were surrounded. But then the weather cleared, Allied air power returned, and from every direction, through snow and mud and frozen forests, came the Shermans. Hundreds of them. Thousands of them. Powered by those rejected engines, they ground forward through the Ardennes, encircling German spearheads, cutting off supply lines, and ultimately smashing the offensive into irrelevance. A German tank commander, captured after the battle, was interrogated by American intelligence officers. When asked why the offensive failed, he did not cite tactics or air power. "You have too many tanks," he said simply. "We destroy 10. 20 more arrive. You can replace everything. We cannot." The Sherman's vulnerabilities were real and deadly, but its strengths, its mechanical reliability, its logistical simplicity, its sheer ubiquity, were strategic advantages that no amount of superior German engineering could overcome. And at the core of that reliability was the R-975. It was not a glamorous engine. It did not win engineering awards, but it started every time. It ran in the deserts of North Africa, where temperatures exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit. It ran in the freezing winters of Belgium and Germany, where oil turned to sludge and metal contracted in the cold. It ran through mud, sand, snow, and fire. By the time the war ended in May 1945, the United States had produced nearly 50,000 Sherman tanks. Tens of thousands of them were powered by the Continental R-975. The engine that had been too weak for airplanes had become strong enough to break the Third Reich, and it had done so not through brilliance, but through persistence. Not through perfection, but through presence. The philosophical implications were profound. Germany had built its war machine on the assumption that superior technology and superior soldiers could overcome numerical disadvantages. The Tiger tank was, in many respects, the best tank of the war. Nearly impervious to most Allied weapons, armed with the devastating 88mm gun, a masterpiece of engineering. But Germany could only produce 1,147 Tigers during the entire war. In the same period, the United States produced 50,000 Shermans. Quality, it turned out, was not enough. Quantity, reliable, endless, industrial quantity, was a quality all its own. The symbolic weight of the R-975 extended beyond mere mechanics. It represented a fundamentally different understanding of warfare, of production, of societal organization. The German war economy, despite its reputation for efficiency, was fragmented, chaotic, riven by internal competition between rival bureaucracies and party factions. German factories produced dozens of different tank models, each requiring unique parts, unique training, unique logistics. The American war economy, by contrast, standardized everything. The Sherman was not the only tank America produced, but it was the primary tank, and that singularity of focus allowed for economies of scale that Germany could never match. The R-975 engine became a microcosm of that philosophy. It was not custom-built for the Sherman. It was adapted, repurposed, mass-produced. It embodied the pragmatic, industrial logic that defined the American way of war. Make it good enough, make it reliable, and make it in overwhelming numbers. That logic extended to every aspect of the American war effort, from Liberty ships to B-24 Liberators to M1 Garand rifles. The United States did not try to build the best of everything. It built the best system. And within that system, the R-975 was a perfect cog. German soldiers, encountering the endless stream of American materiel, struggled to comprehend it. They had been raised in a culture that celebrated craftsmanship, precision, the superiority of German engineering. The idea that a rejected airplane engine could power the defeat of the Panzer divisions was almost insulting. But history does not care about elegance. It cares about outcomes. There was another, quieter story embedded in the R-975's success. The story of the people who built it. The workers at Continental Motors, at Fisher Body, at Chrysler's Tank, Arsenal. They were not soldiers, but their labor was as essential to victory as any battlefield maneuver. Many of them were women, stepping into industrial roles for the first time as men shipped overseas. They learned to read blueprints, to operate presses, to torque bolts to precise specifications. They worked 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, in factories that were sweltering in summer and freezing in winter. The engines they built were anonymous. There were no names engraved on cylinder heads, no signatures on crankshafts. But each engine they completed was a small act of defiance against fascism. One worker, a woman named Rose Monroe, who worked at the Willow Run bomber plant, later recalled the strange emotional weight of industrial work during the war. "We didn't see the battles," she said in an interview decades later. "But we knew that every rivet, every bolt, every piece we made, it was going to someone who needed it to survive. That's a heavy thing to carry." Monroe became the face of Rosie the Riveter, the cultural icon representing American women's contribution to the war effort. But her sentiment applied equally to the men and women who built the R-975 engines. They were waging war with wrenches and lathes, and they were winning. By the spring of 1945, as Allied forces crossed the Rhine and drove deep into Germany, the sound of the R-975 echoed through streets that had never imagined defeat. Shermans rolled past the rubble of bombed-out cities, past crowds of displaced persons, past German soldiers too exhausted and demoralized to resist. The Third Reich, which had once believed itself invincible, had been ground down not just by strategy or heroism, but by the relentless mechanical logic of industrial production. The tanks kept coming, the engines kept running, and the war ended not with a dramatic final battle, but with a slow, inevitable collapse. The R-975 did not survive the war as a frontline engine. Jet engines and more powerful diesels replaced it in the post-war years. The Sherman itself, once the symbol of American armored might, was quickly superseded by newer designs like the M26 Pershing and later the M48 Patton. The R-975 faded into obscurity, remembered only by historians and vintage tank enthusiasts, but its legacy endured in a more abstract form. It proved that wars are not won by the best weapons, but by the best systems. That superiority is meaningless without sustainability. That a rejected engine, given purpose and mass production, could change the course of history. Today, a few restored Shermans still rumble at military museums and historical reenactments, their R-975 engines chugging to life after decades of silence. The sound is unmistakable, that 9-cylinder growl steady and unshakable. It is a sound that once filled the ears of liberators and oppressors alike. A sound that rolled across continents, over mountains, through forests, and into the heart of darkness. There is a photograph taken in May 1945 of a Sherman tank parked in front of the ruins of the Reichstag in Berlin. The tank is scarred, its armor pocked with impacts, its treads caked in mud, but the engine is still running. You can see exhaust rising from the vents, a faint shimmer in the spring air. The tank crew sits on the hull, exhausted, smoking cigarettes, staring at the shattered remains of the regime that had promised a 1,000-year reign. And beneath them, unnoticed, unhonored, the Continental R-975 idles quietly, its 9 cylinders still firing in perfect rhythm. That engine had been rejected because it was not powerful enough for the sky, but it had been powerful enough for the earth, powerful enough to carry the weight of history, powerful enough to turn the tide. In the end, the R-975 was not America's secret weapon because it was brilliant. It was America's secret weapon because it was abundant, reliable, and relentless. It was the mechanical embodiment of a larger truth, that freedom, democracy, and industrial might, when unified, create a force that cannot be stopped by superior engineering or tactical genius. The Panzer divisions were defeated not by better tanks, but by more tanks, and those tanks ran on engines no one wanted. The rejected had become essential. The overlooked had become unstoppable. And in that transformation lies a lesson not just about war, but about resilience itself. That greatness is not always forged in the spotlight, but in the steady, unglamorous work of endurance. That history is not written by the perfect, but by the persistent. The Continental R-975 was not the heart of a bomber soaring through clouds. It was the heart of a tank grinding through mud. And in that grinding, relentless forward motion, empires fell,